Get down with D&D.
Yeah, you know me.
Get down with D&D.
Yeah, you know me.
Get down with D&D.
Yeah, you know me.
Who's down with D&D?
This whole party.
Get down with D&D.
Yeah, you know me.
Get down with D&D.
Yeah, you know me.
I'm down with D&D.
Yeah, you know me.
Who's down with D&D?
This whole party.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Down with D&D for another week of excitement and also us. And I'm here as I have been for the last 5 weeks now with Teos Abadia. Hey, Teos.
Hey, Sean, I'm calling in from deep in the jungle. I've been exploring for weeks. I'm running low on rations.
How are you?
I'm just getting in the mood for this.
I know Portland's rough, but wow, that's
oh, we've had a few days in the 90s. We're all dying here. Send aid.
I was going to say yes. The demonstrations have stopped because the temperature rose above 85.
Not impressively, so it's still
yeah.
Portland strong, but yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, stay safe out there, Teos.
Right.
You need to do a remote recording from downtown Portland.
That's right.
So we are going to talk for the third and final time about exploration this week to cover the topics of how to give your players choices and consequences for those choices, as well as covering overland travel in detail. But first, let's have a little bit of our news and notes section. The first, I'm going to let Teos cover.
Yeah, so the Gnomecast, which is a podcast that's part of the Misdirected Mark network that we are part of, Gnomecast had a really cool interview with Keith Baker. Jared Rasher runs the show, and he talked to Keith Baker, the person who came up with the Eberron campaign setting, reviewing Keith Baker's latest DM's Guild book is like a too soft a term, an amazing book called Exploring Eberron.
Yep, so 250 pages of goodness.
Yeah.
As Teos mentioned, it's now adamantine on the DM's Guild. And so if you check out that interview, you can catch Jared. Jared's a great interviewer, great blogger, great podcaster. He's always talking to us on the forums at forums.misdirectedmark.com about what we talk about on the show. So I always love to get his feedback. And you can hear him and Keith talking about that book. And you had a chance to kind of read over some of the book, Exploring Eberron.
Yeah,
what did you think?
I've ordered the hardback because you can get this in beautiful print. So that hasn't arrived, but I have the PDF. And it's great. And in the interview, Jared asks Keith about the book, and Keith really says, this was an amazing opportunity for me to create the things for the setting that I could never quite get into an official product. Like either it got cut or, some other reason, like they just couldn't fit these pieces in. And that includes covering the oceans. And man, that whole thing, like there are these enormous submerged beasts that give off dreams that are just superb. He gives amazing insight into playing the different races that are major in Eberron. Like just the thing on changelings is fantastic. Like there's this art of a changeling holding like, a male or female outfit and kind of like, which one do I go with today? And there's just a lot of really neat stuff in there. Like they do the history of Eberron, and they'll put in character ideas for how the events of a particular era should resonate with your character today. It's great, and it's useful for anybody. It doesn't matter if you're a player or a DM, just good stuff.
Yeah, and as we talked about either last week or 2 weeks ago, it's great that the DM's Guild's available for specifically for people like Keith who have created something that Wizards owns the rights to, but now they can put their spin on it, or as you said, add their content. And we've both worked on hardcovers now for Wizards of the Coast, and we understand that not everything we write is going to get onto the page, and it's not cut because it's bad. It's not cut because it wasn't up to snuff. A lot of times it's cut just for space. Forgotten Realms kind of went through this with everything's on the Sword Coast, right? For 5th edition, everything, it's like, okay, we go from Waterdeep to Baldur's Gate to Neverwinter to Baldur's Gate to Waterdeep, and then we're going to shoot up to Icewind Dale. Oh, we're going to go down to Chult, but we never really get out we haven't seen any huge Thay products or products like that. And similar for Eberron, right? There's Sarlona, there's so many other cool
Zendrick,
places. Zendrick and the Argonessa and all those other areas that you could have a whole setting book just there. And so this is sort of what Keith is doing here. He's expanding, he's putting in some of the cool stuff that he's worked on that's just never quite made it, and now Eberron fans have a chance. So
and it's a beautiful
hopefully book. Hopefully at some point in the near future we will take a deeper dive into exploring Eberron and talk about everything that's in it in greater detail, what we like, how we would use it in campaigns and so on. But we just don't have the time for that right now. So we have several topics that we want to talk about. So we'll get to that at some point. The next little bit of news I wanted to talk about was the UA subclass article. They had 2 new subclasses, and I wanted to just go into detail on one briefly. We're not going to take a whole show to cover it, but I just wanted to run through it and touch on a few things. So the first one was the College of Spirits Bard. And this is the bard that, not surprisingly, based on the name, talks to spirits. And the spirits sort of lead them. It's kind of the bard version of the Path of the Ancestors for the barbarian. Yep. So, this bard is in touch with the spirits and sort of uses they use gaming sets, basically, the article says. So they're tarot cards, dice, different ways to contact the spirits and have the spirits lead them. If we're going to break it down mechanically, at 3rd level, they get Guiding Whispers. It makes the guidance a bard cantrip, which the bard automatically gets. And instead of being a touch cantrip, the guidance from this bard cantrip can be done at 60 feet. I'm okay with this. I'm not a huge fan of guidance in general because I think it's just one of those things that becomes an automatic go-to. Oh, you're going to do something. Wait, here, guidance. I'm a fan of the flavor of it, but not of the spell. And I feel like bards already have bardic inspiration, so this is just sort of you cast guidance and then you give another die. It's just kind of more of the same.
Yeah, agreed.
I would love to see something else there other than that. Also at 3rd level, they get they can begin to use as their spellcasting focus these different objects: a skull, a deck of cards, that sort of thing. All I can think of is Hamlet with with the gravedigger down. Yeah, alas, poor Yorick, I knew him well. Talking with the spirits. So at 3rd level, you can get that, use those tools as your focus. And then at 6th level, now this was weird to me. It says at 6th level, you can cast a bard spell that deals damage. When you cast a bard spell that deals damage or restores hit points through this spiritual focus, roll a d6, and you gain a bonus to 1 roll of the spell equal to the number rolled. I have no clue what that means. I can guess what that means.
There's some wording tweaking that will need to happen there, but
I assume it reads you roll a d6 and you add either the hit points regained or the damage dealt. But it's a lot of to do for maybe you roll this d6 and you get a 1 and so now it doesn't matter, or you roll a 2, it's a big whoop, or like you replace a 1 with a 2. Like I have no idea what they're trying to do. So hopefully that will get sorted out when feedback is taken in.
Yeah.
So also at 3rd level, you get a feature called Tales from Beyond. Now this is really interesting to me. I'm all about simplicity in my rules. And so my natural reaction is, as soon as I see something that becomes really complicated, I'm like, I don't want it. But I put that aside to look at this. So while you're holding your spiritual focus, you can use a bonus action to expend 1 of your bardic inspiration and then you roll on this spirits tales table, using your bardic inspiration die to determine the tale. So there's a table with 12 entries. A bardic inspiration die starts at a d4, goes up to a d12. And so instead of just giving that die to a character to use for whatever they would generally use, they're rolling this die, or you can do it on yourself, and then you get the ability of whatever the tale is that you're telling. So, for example, if you roll a 1, you get the beast tale. You recite the tale of a clever animal. For 1 minute, the target has advantage on wisdom perception checks and advantage on attack rolls against the creature if another enemy is within 5 feet of it and that enemy isn't incapacitated. The wording's a little bit confusing, but you see what the deal is. And there are 12 of these things. So it's sort of a little mini wand of wonder that you're getting something from. I love the feel of this. I love the flavor of this, right? A spirit overtakes you and you tell this story and it affects someone so much that they gain this stuff.
Yeah.
The implementation, the execution is very unclear,
and
because it's weird because you're doing something and you're giving someone's a power, but then they are using that power. So it's kind of a 2-layer approach. Some of them are things that last forever, or not forever, but last for a long time. You gain temporary hit points, or the person that you give this to gains temporary hit points. So that seems to start immediately and go on. There are some things that seem to start immediately, like until the end of your next turn, you become invisible, or until you attack a creature. So it's unclear whether that it happens right away or if that becomes an ability that can be turned on at some point in the future. And then there are some things that, like the original one I read, that lasts for a minute. So does that start right away, or does that start when the character that received that power decides to start it? It's this weird. There are some things that happen immediately in combat. There are some things that can be triggered later. It's kind of a mishmash, and it doesn't quite clearly state when it takes place.
And I love the concept, this idea of tails, and the tails have teeth because of this table, right? The tail of the dark spirit, the tail of the giant, like these are neat. But one thing I really hate with anything mechanically, and I tend not to use hate, but I feel strongly negatively about, is whenever I am going to expend something, in this case my bardic inspiration, for a very uncertain result, and especially if that result could be, this is useless or it doesn't work, right? Like if I might want one of these things to kick in, but there are no enemies in the room, but most of these deal with enemies. And so I can just waste it, or I have to breathe fire on my friends. Like, why would I have told the tale of the dragon and caused us to immolate each other?
Right. Yeah. It's if you're going to do it, I know people love randomness, but not everybody does. And a lot of people want to know what they're, like you said, they want to know what they're getting for their money, right? I'm spending this. I want to know what it's going to do.
Yeah.
I would almost rather just see a shorter list. If your die is a D4, you can do this one thing. If your die is a D6, you can do these 2 things, and go up from there and let them choose.
Yeah, let them choose. One thing that's interesting
becomes,
too is bardic inspiration normally cannot be used on yourself, and so then this suddenly breaks that, and I'm not sure kind of why it's chosen to do so mechanically.
Yeah, because it took me a while to figure out. It's like a 4-paragraph little intro with all the ifs and ands or buts, and it only says at once, and it's parenthetical. You can use an action to choose one creature you can see within 30 feet of you. This can be you. It took me forever to find that, to see, hey, can you do it for yourself? So that's there. Needs some work. Love the flavor. Love the idea. Needs to come together a little bit rules wise. There's also something called Spirit Session. At 6th level, you can channel spirits to gain insights into magic. You can conduct an hour-long ritual channeling spirits using your focus. When you're done, depending on the number of people who joined you in this ritual, you can learn a spell from a different class spell list up to a level of the number of people who were doing this ritual with you. And then there's a few other things. You have to be able level to cast it. And it has to be either a divination or a necromancy spell. Again, interesting. I love the seance feel, right? I love that we're going to do a seance and summon these spirits. I like the flexibility of getting this. You get a spell, but you can only get it for a brief time, and you have to sort of work your way up to it. What I want to know is, it takes an hour to do. Does that count as a short rest? I would assume no, but they're going to need to spell that out, because that's the payoff versus. Are we going to let the barbarian heal using hit dice, or are we going to drag him into this?
And since you're a
ritual
bard, could you do your song of rest for during the short rest the barbarian wants to take, while you and the cleric do this ritual? Probably not, but it doesn't say so. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of things, and this is the hard part. This is where the Wizards team's earning their money, right? Because anybody can just take a subclass that's already there and swap out fire for cold, or swap out this ability for that ability. But when you start to create things like this is the hard part, right? This is where you have to answer those questions. You have to make it an elegant, but still useful ability that players are going to want, B, like. So it's tough.
Yeah, and Wizards gives us a window into this process when they're partly done, because they're in many ways taking the temperature of how we feel about things. So rather than, they could take this particular feature, any of these features we've talked about, and they could refine it to where it's great. The language works, it's balanced, all that, and then present it to us, and we might say, we don't like it. So here they get that feedback midstream, and then they can do all of the tweaks, or just dump the entire thing. Well, nobody liked this concept, and there's no reason to tweak it.
Right. Yep. And that's, as you said, that's the reason why I am very forgiving of something that's unclear, because this is more or less, how do you feel about it, rather than parsing the language like I've been doing. But I like to parse that language just to show people how hard it can be to create these things.
Yeah, and it's so hard to get that the deep sense, right? To where you read all these features and you go, this is exactly what this bard's about. And that's a challenging thing to do. And the best subclasses really pull that off, right? They really say, here's what this person is focusing on and doing.
Yep. And so the final one is I think it's at 14th level. Your connection to spirits has become semi-permanent. Whenever you use that Tales from Beyond feature, which lets you roll about those spirit tales, you can roll a d6 and use it instead of expending a bardic inspiration die. So in other words, you don't have to expend the die. You can roll a d6, but you're only going to get those first 6 tales. You're not going to get any of the more powerful ones that are 7 through 12.
Why does it say you still use your bardic for the?
Yeah, but then the next line,
the
next line is weird, because you can still use your bardic inspiration die for the Tales effect without expending it, but you just said instead of expending it in the previous one. So I don't know what's up with that.
I see. So I get it. So the table already took into effect that the higher rolls are better, because you roll a die equal to your bardic inspiration die, so you won't always have access to all these. And then that feature is saying, well, you can get one of the first 6 for free. Yeah.
Right. But then the next line says you can still use your bardic inspiration die for the Tales effect. I'm like, okay, that makes sense, because if you want a higher one, let's roll to see if we can get a higher one. But then it says without expending it. Well, if you're not going to expend it, then why not just roll it anyway? So it's kind of unclear. Yep. But overall, I don't hate it. I like the flavor. It's the hard part is always in those details. So we'll see what the general feedback is. And I don't know if the survey is up yet for giving feedback for this, but if it is, head over there if you've read this and leave your feedback, because that's what they need. They need as many people as they can voicing their opinions. And maybe next week we will look at the second one, the Undead Warlock.
Hey, speaking of surveys,
Yeah.
so Dungeons and Dragons dropped what they called D&D Survey 2020.
Oh yeah.
And that thing is huge.
Yeah.
I definitely want everybody to fill it out, but set aside some time to do so. I made the mistake of doing it like, when my family wanted me for something. I'm like, it'll just be a little bit longer. And they're like, that just kept saying that to them for an hour.
Right. No, yeah, it took me, I took it pretty quickly, and it took me, I think, at least 35 minutes.
Yeah.
So pack a lunch, but definitely give your feedback. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up, because I forgot. Super important, right, to what they're going to be doing. They want to know how you use the game.
Yeah. And it had it has the kind of typical, what editions you start with, what kind of things, but then it really dealt with digital products a lot, which was very interesting and seemed to suggest digital tools that they want to offer.
Right. And it's funny because a lot of people online were like, well, how I've played has changed because I play online now. So what good is this? Well, they ask that in the survey. They specifically say, when you play in person, what do you use? What tools? How do you play? When you play online, what tools do you use? How do you play? So it's there to touch on both aspects.
And it's another opportunity to vote for Dark Sun as your next world you want to see.
As your favorite world. That's right. Teos.
One other little thing we don't have to get into, but it's made a lot of rounds on Twitter, is that they have a section where they ask about various designers and how it influences your kind of decision to buy. Like, it's sort of, if this name was on the cover, and it's a fascinating list of names.
Yeah.
From dead, famous creators, right. Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax, to folks that I wouldn't have expected Wizards to put on the survey, like Jonathan Tweed,
like Rob Heinze. Yeah, Rob Heinze
worked on third edition, but maybe I think they were trying to choose the names that are most likely to register really across the base of people who play. And when you're like in today's Twitter world, there's like a set of names you think of. But when you really look at like what your average gamer is probably not on Twitter, not on the D&D Facebook page or any of these other things, they see what's on products. And a lot of these names are names that have been in products over and over again, right? Fascinating.
Yeah, it was really fascinating. And I was shocked. I did when I saw that question.
But it also made me somewhat happy, because some of those names are just, like Rob Heinze is just, I think the world of him as a person. And so that's neat that Wizards is even thinking still about these folks, even when they've made products that are sort of competing, right? So it's great.
Right.
Really cool.
Yeah. Yeah. And the last bit of news, you wanted to mention our buddy Sly Flourish.
Yeah, Mike Shea. This is just a quick mention that his latest post that dropped on Monday was how to run Descent into Avernus, and he is working through the chapters as he runs his various groups. He often runs 2 groups through an adventure, so he just gets a lot of experience that he can pass on how to do this. And he's done guides for most of the major books. And this is another thing that I would say, if you're running Descent into Avernus, you don't want to miss what Sly Flourish covers on how to make, especially in this article, he talks about how to make the story compelling for players, and it's really good to read.
Yeah, I took a quick glance at it, and I'm particularly interested in how he got through chapter 2 for personal reasons, let's say. But also a previous edition of this show covered most of that book. So if you want to go back and look at some of the previous episodes, we do talk about up to about chapter 3 or so about running it. So
yeah, it was good. Good coverage.
You can check those out as well. And now let us move on with our main topic today, which is part 3 of our Exploring Exploration. And so just to recap, we talked about the 3 pillars: combat, role-playing, exploration. And decided that exploration is probably the least comfortable for players, DMs, and writers. We looked at specific types of exploration, how to try to do them well, and how to combine exploration with other types of encounters to make them more memorable. And in this final episode, we are going to ask a few questions and hopefully answer them. How do you give players choices and consequences in exploration? How to use exploration to tell a fun story? And how do you handle overland travel as part of that exploration pillar? And I'm going to let Teos take the reins here, and I'm going to just chirp in every once in a while.
I think you're saying that I should be the navigator.
You should definitely be the navigator.
We've done this now for 3 episodes. I'm going to just make exploration jokes.
Yeah, the whole time.
The whole time. So yeah, one thing that resonates with us, you and I as designers, is we see that when you give players choices, it makes a vast difference in the appeal to the players. And that is a key part of the exploration pillar. And again, as we said before, exploration is not just travel from A to B, it's everything that involves this kind of engagement. And so when there are choices, when characters have the opportunity to succeed, to gain a reward, to see consequences, that really registers with players and creates a good relationship that pays off throughout your campaign. So when I'm designing and I'm tapping into the exploration pillar, I think of the world as open rather than a tunnel. And even when the design is linear, like we're going to go to a market, we're going to learn a room about a dungeon, then we're going to go into the dungeon, I'm creating many choices. You could speak to anybody in the market. Various different people could give you the information. You might learn it in different ways. So when you design that way, you create this sort of open experience that gives choice, and the choice feels tangible. They chose to go to the armor merchant or the map maker, and then it plays out differently based on that.
Yeah. And I just wanted to touch base here, just kind of give an abstract about what one of my points of game design, which is covered here. And that is, the world can be as open or as confined as you like, as a DM, and the story that you're telling with your players within that world can be as open or as confined as you like. But at some point, there has to be a confinement of mechanics and rules. You need to always be thinking of cool ways to use mechanics to move the characters through the world and through the story, without resorting to just pass fail. You know, you want to do a thing. You want to think of different ways to allow the characters to do that thing, and then the cool stories that will move the game forward after that. So you don't want to be exploring a dungeon and say, okay, there's a door there that's locked, and you cannot open it. Well, then you cannot go to the rest of the dungeon, right? You want to avoid that sort of confinement. But you still want there to be a confinement of consequences that are decided or triggered by how they go about doing the task they need to do. And you can use that situation to cover almost anything in the game, whether it's a combat, whether it's a story, whether it's a role-playing scene. You can always think of it as, I'm going to be as open as I possibly can, but within that openness, there has to be degrees of success that allow the story to move forward, but there to always be consequences based on what the characters decide to do and how well they do it.
Yeah, and that success and failure, talking about it when I was especially as a younger DM in my high school years, like I always thought of that as like life or death, right? Just hit point loss or gold pieces. And it doesn't have to be at all like that. It can be just anything that's reinforcing that a decision was made and that the choice mattered. And it can be just very small things in terms of picking up a clue or getting some reinforcement about a plot point. All of that can help, right? You're talking to the guards because you think that if you were to fool them, you could gain access to something. And they give you a tip that says, yeah, you would get access to that thing, right? Players love that. Like, yes, I learned that piece from them. I know that we're on the right path. Perfect, right?
Right. And I mean, or it can be as simple as character A loves beer, right? And so because they failed at this one thing, his favorite beer, either the barkeep has cut him off, right? It's a very
Yeah.
small, tiny thing, right? But it is a consequence because they failed that persuasion check with the mayor.
Yeah.
Right. So the story didn't end there, right? The mayor still gave them the information or still
Yep.
sent them out on the mission, but the mayor went over to the
Yeah, no more.
bar and said, no more for them
I love it.
or no more for him. Yeah. So that's a consequence, not game changing, not life or death, but something very small that continues the story.
When I think about, on Twitter, you and I both kind of posted tweets to say what works, what doesn't around exploration, and there was a lot there that came back, especially from DMs, where exploration just can often end up in a situation that's not fun. And it's very important that the exploration be fun. The engagement should be rewarding. It should be stimulating. It should be fun to watch for the DM, fun for the players to participate in. And so to kind of do that, you want to think of it in terms of how you engage the players, how that interaction is going to pay off. What can I add to this room that the players will want to interact with? And it can be really simple, really obvious stuff. We talked about last episode, room with kobolds in it, and there's just a big, huge lever in the middle of the room. Someone's going to want to pull that, right? That's fun. And even if they don't, it's still going to be fun. They're going to be thinking about it as players, like, oh man, we didn't pull the lever, right? What can be revealed? What's going to happen as a result of that engagement? What is the payoff? And you can just put anything in a room and ask yourself these questions, and it'll start to come up with those ideas that will end up being fun. How do the choices matter? When it comes to traps, seeing that traps are not a punishment mechanism or a hit point robbing device. They are exploration. You want engagement. You don't just want, oh, you perceived it, never mind, there was a pit trap, you're done. You see the pit trap, the lid is closed. What do? Maybe there's something in the pit. Maybe there's a lever in the pit. You actually need to get into the pit, right? So you can engage people through devices like traps. When in doubt, I always ask myself this question: what would a movie or a novel do?
Yeah.
Movies and novels do not give you boring things to interact with, at least not the good ones. They skip to the neat things, and they put in these kinds of engagement pieces, right? You think through any Indiana Jones piece, those things that you see in a room are there to be messed with. They're going to play a role. There are huge statues of Egyptian gods because they are going to be toppled, right? Like there are snakes on the floor for a reason. Like all of that is put in there to create this engagement.
Yeah. And it's some people might think it boring to do certain things. Like if this novel goes into this long backstory, at least make it about the characters, right? Not about something outside of the lives of the PCs at your table, because then at least you're giving these details, and you're giving the players some grist for their role-playing mill or their storytelling mill, when you add those details.
And like a novel, you want to focus on exciting pieces. You want your scenes to tell a story. Like my wife has worked in film. You do not create a scene randomly. Every scene, the backdrop, the location, like this is thought about very carefully, right? They have people who go out and take pictures of all the possible places you could film something, and they choose them for reasons to sell you on this concept of what's taking place. So you think of what's your establishing shot when you imagine this scene. What is it that's being told here? What's the reason for it? What are you going to engage with? What stories are going to be told through that? And what's the payoff at the end of it?
Mm-hmm. And even in fiction writing, you're still doing that, right? You are still looking at everything through a lens. It's the lens of the narrator. The reader cannot see it, but in your description, you might zoom in, right? Zoom is a literary tool as much as a visual tool.
Yeah.
So, yeah, absolutely.
I want to mention here on this subject of how to transform your view of exploration. There's a person both on Twitter and on YouTube, Eberron Disney, and they have a series of really good videos that are worth looking up on YouTube, and we'll have a link in the show notes. And one of them is a video on exploration, And he talks about the cycle of presenting a scene, players reacting, DM reacting to their reaction, presenting new information based on that, and repeating this. And this idea of this cycle is a very valuable one to think about. It's not just finite design, but you're putting things that can be messed with. How the players mess with it then drives how you continue to play out that scene.
Mm-hmm. And the best DMs out there, if you watch them, they do that, right? They give only a certain amount of information. They don't give the 12-page explanation of everything in the room. They hit the highlights, and then the players go over to the altar. Then you can zoom in on the altar and react to those players. So, that's great advice, even outside of exploration, just the terms of back and forth with players and DMs.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so shall we dig into overland travel?
Let's do this. We
talked before about how a lot of DMs and players as well, when you mention the exploration pillar, this is what they think of, but it's really just a small part of it. But it is a critical part because it comes up and it has very arcane rules that are actually spread across several places. Overland travel is not only moving across the map of the world, it also can cover moving in a large dungeon or underdark setting or other situations like that. And it need not be on foot. It can be in vehicles or flying or all sorts of things like that. But it is a place, it is the set of rules that cover when you're crossing large distances. The mechanics get into all kinds of things like getting lost, how many hexes per day you cover. Those mechanics, I think, can be a trap a bit, in that part is like a mini game. And if all you do is play that mini game, there are much better games out there.
Yeah, that's a great point, right? That's a great point, because it's just what we talked about. Is that really the coolest thing, right? You get to travel 3 or 4 hexes in a day. Is that, what your players are going to be talking about at the end of the session? Oh, we got to cover 4 hexes instead of 3,
right?
Because we went faster. We couldn't stealth, but we did go faster. So, boy, good on us.
Yeah.
No, that's not what they talk about, right?
Absolutely. And so that is while it's good to know these rules, and we're going to review them here, they're the least important part. It's what you do with it and how you weave a story around this framework that is good. And so let's kind of pull back and say, before we get into the mechanics, what's the goal? So there are a number of goals that overland travel can help us achieve. One is reveal the map. This is tying us into the primal stories of exploring the unknown. When we were in class, we're learning about history and we hear about these explorers. We're heading west, right? I live in Oregon. Marco Polo, right? Dante's Inferno, right? Example of Avernus, where you're traveling through the layers of hell and exploring all of this.
And this is even more important when you say are using a homebrew world for the players, because if you're playing the Forgotten Realms, the players can go online and within 10 seconds find 32 different maps over the editions of the world, so they know what's there. But if you're if you have new players who haven't done that, or if you have a new world that you're presenting to your players, this sort of revealing the map can be like the coolest part of the game, right? Yeah. The volcano that they didn't know was there that's erupting now. Yeah. That sort of thing. But yeah.
It's a change of pace, which is really nice. So we tend to do a lot of D&D is enclosed encounters, minutes on the clock, and then we go to a totally different scale of hours or days at a time in this open wilderness. And you can see how novels and movies do this, like Lord of the Rings, all those travel scenes, right? They enable them to tell stories on a different scale, like they can show the training of the hobbits. And because we know it's a long time now, it makes sense, right? There's just different pace.
Right. Yeah.
It's a different feel to overland travel. There are different challenges. So things like camping under the stars, setting watch, do you light a fire, right? Mm-hmm. These kinds of questions that can be really neat, sort of even spooky. natural hazards, right? There can be a mudslide or heavy rain, things like that. Survival, do we have enough food? Orienteering, getting lost, right? That's a very different type of game and a really neat experience. Major choices, there's a fork in the road, and one of them's less traveled. Do we travel off the road or on it? Do we go through the swamp filled with undead, according to the legends, or do we go through the ash-covered volcanic pass?
Yep. And those are great things for both, player choices, but also story. The players can really debate this, and they can use it to tell their own character stories, as long as that's what they're into. But what you want to avoid, and again, you just need a little bit of forethought here, is no consequences for any of these. Do you travel on the road or off the road? If the only difference between traveling on the road and off the road is it takes an extra day to get where they're going, then it really doesn't do anything for the story or the game, unless there are consequences. And the consequences are something that the players at least can guess at.
Yeah.
To become part of the conversation.
Yeah, if you think of Lord of the Rings, right, they make those choices like, do we go through this frozen mountain pass? Do we go through the mines of Moria? And those choices, they are significant, quite epic, but they also are an opportunity by which the DM, the novel, the movie, tells us about the land, right? Mm-hmm. What it's like. Cultures, borders, terrain changes, climate, festivals, the vegetation, the types of monsters that are around, the fates that befell nations, like all of these things come out based on those character choices.
Yeah. And you make a good point in the show notes here about like the different nations and towns in Storm King's Thunder, right? Now that these giants are rampaging, what does it mean for all of these different places?
Yeah, it's a great way to explain the world as you're traveling through it. So all of these are kind of our high level goals, right? And hopefully these, to anybody listening, sound super exciting. And so what you, again, do not want to do is then just end up turning exploration into, oh, you wanted to move 2 hexes south, but you got lost and moved 1 hex east. Like, that is not all these things we just talked about, right? That does not give you the goals.
Right.
It needs to be a framework under which you're then choosing to tell the pictures. But let's review the mechanics, and we are going to do so here to some extent. But I think maybe you and I we've talked about we might create something here that's a helpful guide for people and release it.
Okay, yeah, that would be I would think that might be appreciated. I know I would appreciate it. Me
too. I mean, I had to do a lot of research to look through this, and it really is interesting how things are in different chapters. It's not all in one place in one way, and I've looked at a number of good guides, and those I would say even don't always cover everything. So I think it'll be useful when we do that.
Yeah. No, you can continue.
So here's the process for overland travel. You start by breaking out the map of the world and saying, here's where we're starting, your starting location. And the scale of a hex map is generally 1 hex is 1 mile, or 1 hex is 6 miles. That's per the DMG. But you can change that. And in fact, Tomb of Annihilation has 10 miles for each hex. So it's pretty big. One thing to keep in mind is it makes the math harder when you change the scale, which Tomb of Annihilation does.
Of course.
Next thing you want to do is you want to determine the weather. This gives you a feel for what the day is like. And it's pretty cool. You roll 3 different tables to see your temperature, whether it's hot or cold or normal, your wind and precipitation. The results can have teeth. So extreme cold and heat imposes saves and can give you exhaustion. Exhaustion can be a very difficult mechanic, especially because there are other things in exploration that deal with exploration or exhaustion. Strong winds affect ranged weapons. They can affect perception, hearing. You can't fly unless you have magical flight. In the desert, you have sandstorms, and any terrain can sort of modify these rules.
Right.
Then precipitation.
It'll be interesting.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see what they do with Icewind Dale with blizzards and all of that
Yeah.
that sort of thing.
Yeah, and
But,
whether they will go into exploration the way that, Tomb of Annihilation did, that'd
yeah,
be interesting.
yeah,
Precipitation can also obscure. It gives you disadvantage on sight. So if you have strong winds and heavy precipitation, you have disadvantage on all forms of perception. So that establishes your weather. And I like this a lot as a start because it gives me a way to begin to tell that story of what's happening today. And basically, I in my notes will make a note like, okay, there are going to be really strong winds at some point today, and then I'll make that point to introduce that. Maybe it's during an encounter, maybe it's before it, whatever. So now we get to the player side in that the players select roles, and there's a whole piece on Player's Handbook, page 182 or so, that tells you about the party roles, whereas the weather is on Dungeon Master's Guide, page 109. So we choose our roles, and the important one here is the navigator. And this is a character that's going to be involved in plotting the course of how everybody travels across the map.
Right.
The biggest thing to note here is if you have a ranger, the rules will change. And so we'll talk about that here. Other roles include noticing threats, drawing a map, tracking, and foraging, and those can all play a role there. The Outlander background has a feature that they automatically find food and fresh water for themselves and 5 others in suitable terrain. There are DCs in the Dungeon Master's Guide, page 111, for foraging. But the main thing about navigating is you're trying to not get lost. If you're a ranger and it's your favorite terrain, you can't get lost. That's very handy. But otherwise, you have an opportunity to get lost that's going to come in. You also are going to choose a pace to travel. And there are 3 paces you can go at in the Player's Handbook, page 181, fast, normal, and slow. And as an example here, to get a feel for it, you can, on your typical 6 miles to a hex map, you can cover 4 hexes normally, slow is 3, and fast is 5. And that does make a difference over time. When I ran Tomb of Annihilation, it made a big difference that because of having a ranger with this favored terrain, they could go pretty quickly, and that'll affect things. If the terrain is difficult terrain, like thick jungle, then you're moving at half speed, so that really makes it much slower. But rangers in their favorite terrain, ignore that. It can be worth considering house ruling rangers a little bit if you are if your world consists of a particular terrain very strongly. You may want to sort of change that up. So in my home campaign for Tomb of Annihilation, I sort of had the player pick a region of the map that they knew about. And that was the region in which they got these bonuses. But the rest was unexplored and unknown to them. And then they behave more normally.
Yeah.
And I was going to say this later, but it's probably worth saying now that I think it's really good in a session 0 for your campaign, or the first time you start to do overland travel, pause and ask your players how gritty and realistic they want things to be. When I talked to my players, they were pretty clear. We do not want to be starving or out of water or scrounging for stuff.
Yeah.
Don't want it. It was unanimous on a survey that I did. So, okay, we took that out. And so having a ranger was actually really perfect here. It's like you're never getting lost. We're just going to assume you never run out of food or water. And we're not going to worry about things like, unclean water or mosquitoes or anything. And we're going to focus on cool things along the way. And that's good to know how much your characters want one way or the other.
Yeah, I mean that makes every difference, right? Because if they don't want that, then all the stuff we're talking about is sort of
you get to
hand waved.
You get to change it, and you can even hand wave all over, right? You can just like Mike Shea in reviewing Descent into Avernus Chapter 2. He says, "I like to put one encounter in between any 2 places that they travel." That's a totally reasonable thing to do, right? You were traveling, here's what you find halfway across, right? It gives you some color, tells a story, and you move on. You can do that too. But I think hex crawling can be fun. There is something to be said, and I think Tomb of Annihilation is a great example where you really are sort of, it's like one of my friends actually did this, painted over the map of Chult and scratched away individual hexes as they explored. And it's really fun to sort of uncover things and find a lost city or find a tall peak or things like that.
Right.
One of the things to keep in mind when you're doing overland travel is mounts. The rules are sort of not what you'd expect for most mounts in that they give you fast pace for an hour, but you have to have new mounts available every 8 to 10 miles to keep that up. So if all you're doing is riding horses, you basically get an hour of fast for free, which is kind of nothing.
Right.
Ships are different. Ships give you their speed, whatever their speed is, with no penalties or benefits from fast or slow. And then what really breaks everything is flying mounts. And what will especially do it is if your characters can conjure mounts. So if you have a druid who can summon flying creatures several times a day, they can jet through the Tomb of Annihilation map. Because a flying griffin that flies at 80 can travel 8 miles an hour. That's 12 hexes.
Wow.
So when we're talking about, normally it's 4, this is, 2 if it's fast, if it's difficult terrain. So thick jungle, 2 hexes, now you're traveling 12. So that's a lot. And so if you can conjure multiple mounts, it goes away. And so you have to think through that and talk through that and then decide how to play that. We had a conversation about that.
Right. And again, it comes down to consequences for actions chosen. If they get there fast, they're up in the air. What else is up in the air? Dragons?
Yep. Yeah.
Right? I mean, there's always give a choice and always give consequences for it.
Yeah, and you can plan for it. One of the things I do when I'm running is as they start getting to the levels where this is possible, you want to think about how to give people hints, because they can miss things, right? One of the problems when you go very quickly from one, teleporting, for example, from one place to another, is you don't get to see all the things in between. And some of those things had important plot points and clues, and right. So you want to not miss that. So finding ways to route them back to these important locations through rumors, or someone they meet in a particular place, a guide they hire, things like that.
Sure.
So let's get back. So that kind of sets us the possibilities of your pace and how you travel. What you're going to do on that daily basis, after you figure out the weather, you're going to ask the navigator and the party how fast they want to go. The navigator is going to make a wisdom survival check to not get lost. How often you make that check is up to the DM. Tomb of Annihilation says once per day. So, feel free. I think that worked pretty well. There's a DC. Tomb of Annihilation adds additional DCs for different terrains. And you get a bonus or penalty depending on whether you're going slow or fast pace. If you have a good map, you have advantage. Ranger, you can't get lost. So you roll and see whether you get lost. If you succeed, you know exactly where you're going in the map. And you get to kind of, plot out your map. And I do recommend having a physical map printed out that players can draw on. That's a lot of fun. I would unroll that for each session with Tomb of Annihilation, and it was great fun to kind of mark things off. If you fail, you inadvertently move in the wrong direction and become lost. And the way this is kind of easiest done is you roll a d6 because it's a hex. That's the random square. You determine where they went to. They don't know they're in a different square. They just simply don't know what square they're in. So they do know they're lost. They could have theoretically gotten in the correct location, 1 out of 6 chance, but they don't know. And then you have to repeat the check at whatever the rate is. So it could be the following day, or if you want, you could have some event happen and maybe they end up back on track. Usually once they get lost, they'll stop because they don't want to go in the wrong direction, but they could theoretically continue moving on and hope that they're going in the right direction, but that's a bad idea. Then the other big part of this is determining random encounters. The DMG is actually I like the advice here. It really does a good job of saying, how often is whenever it makes sense. And they say if you want to check randomly, consider doing it once per hour, once every 4 to 8 hours, or once during the day and once during a long rest. So they cover a lot of options. They do not nail you down to one thing. Their role is a D20, 18 or higher as an encounter. The DMG talks about how to create random encounter tables. Xanathars provides them by each biome on page 92 of Xanathars. So to me, random encounters can be great. They can be a nice departure. I wrote about this in my blog the other day, last week. I like to use them to tell stories. So to me, it's important that the random encounter, this is an opportunity for you to do what a novel or a movie does. right?
Mhm.
Something has happened while they're traveling this day. Let's have it tell a story. Let's have it fit into the larger encounter. And so
Yeah.
even if you're ad-libbing and rolling, take that opportunity
Mhm.
to do so.
Yep. Even if it's a random encounter, it's still a story important encounter. Yep.
The last part of overland travel is food and drink. If you are, unlike my players, willing to do with these kinds of rules of tracking your rations and so on, then the player's handbook, page 185, tells you need a pound of food a day. You can, makes it a little complicated, you can go half day without food. So you can kind of go half rations. And then you can go without food for a number of days equals to 3 plus your con modifier. So if I'm a +3 con, I can go 6 days without food. But whenever I reach my limit, I have a level of exhaustion. No check, just gain exhaustion. Normal day of eating resets the counter. So it's not too hard for adventurers to get past that. But if you have someone with a +1, that's 4 days, it could happen, right? If you're really bad at foraging. Or at the very least, what it does is it kind of forces some engagement to be like, well, okay, I'm going to forage while we travel instead of keeping watch and being alert. Water is a gallon of water per day, 2 if it's hot. If you drink half amount or less, actually, if you drink half that amount, if you drink half a gallon, you must make a con save DC 15, or you get a level of exhaustion at the end of that day. If you drink less than half a gallon, you automatically take a level of exhaustion, no roll. So it has a lot of teeth, right? The other thing that's a really bizarre kind of rule, if you already have exhaustion from some other reason, you take 2 levels of exhaustion.
Oof. And then you start moving at half speed, which doubles the time. Yeah, it's pretty rough.
No es muy bueno. Avoid running out of water. So this is the food thing. It's kind of like, but the water, oh wow, like run out of water and you very quickly are facing some serious trouble. There are things, like your good berry and all that kind of other stuff and foraging that can make up for this. But you're the DM. You get to decide whether this is an area where there's, maybe you're in the desert. There's no water, right?
Yeah.
The other thing that foraging covers a certain number of people, so you may need several people to forage, and there's that chance if you need to cover multiple roles, you could fail at foraging and not get quite enough. So it can be something to experiment, but again, do not get bogged down in this as a mini game mechanic and forget the larger story of it. Have it be a small piece of your game that adds this little bit of flavor about making it through the tough environment, and then get back to the larger story. Tomb of Annihilation has dehydration rules as a special check at the end of the day because that area is so hot, and it has rules for fresh water. So you can tap into those if you want a little more information. It also reminds us that traveling with any kind of mount requires, or beasts or companions, they must stay hydrated too. Rangers in favored terrain, again, it's awesome. Twice as much foraging with a success, and you can also still be noticing while foraging. So love your ranger. Keep them close.
Yes.
The last thing is to keep in mind is at the end of the day, you've got to take that long rest. You need 6 hours of sleep over an 8-hour period. The other 2 hours have to be light activity. Xanathar's has your rules for removing armor, page 77 to 78, if you want to get technical about, armor. And wake them up in the middle of the night when they're not wearing armor and things like that. You can only do 1 long rest per 24 hours. You regain all your last hit points, and something that many DMs forget, you regain up to half of your spent hit dice, not all your spent hit dice.
Yeah. So the question I always have about that is, say you're 12th level, you have 12 hit dice. Does that mean you only gain back 6? Or that you gain back half of what you spent?
I think it's supposed to be half. It says the wording is half of your spent. So if you had spent all your hit dice, you would regain 6 the first night. If you lost no further ones, the next night you'd get 3 back.
Okay.
Right? I mean, that's the way if I read the rules, that's what it's saying, which is fascinating. But so it really, it takes you several nights to regain everything back.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, because it does say spent, not total.
Yeah. So what are some recommendations you have for DMs who are going to get into this sort of overland exploration, overland travel piece of gaming?
So I would say start with a session 0 for sure. Figure out your players, to what extent they want to track supplies, forage, do things like that. Figure out whether there's a ranger with favorite terrain, because that's going to change the grid of it. Focus when you're looking at that map and they're going from point A to point B. Work on that engagement, right? We're going to uncover the land in this path. The blank map's going to get filled in, and we want it to get filled in with really cool stories, choices, engagement, and create that tale that's going to stand out beyond the rules of it.
Right. Cool. Where can people find the random encounter article that you worked on recently?
Alphastream.org.
Okay.
It covers all about the different techniques to use random encounters. Other recommendations I'd say is Weather and Light are great tools. This is a really cool opportunity to use that limitless effects budget that we have, right?
Mm-hmm.
Your outdoors can be full of really cool weather, lightning, it can be snowstorms or mudslides that tell stories. And even if all you're doing is a role-playing encounter, and I don't mean to minimize role-playing, but if what you're doing is a role-playing encounter, it's different when it's in the pouring rain and everybody's talking through their leather, hoods and stuff like that, versus when it's just on a sunny day, like we always expect.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, and take a look at Tomb of Annihilation. I think that's probably the published adventure that does the most to use these rules. And it has a number of really cool techniques. Like, it uses different zones. It divides the map up so you have areas that are full of undead. You have the sort of mysterious far south. You have coastal areas with pirates, the volcanic ash area, the flaming fist patrol area, right? And that's a good way to think about your travel, to kind of drop these zones, and then you can tell stories that make those zones resonate. You're going through the Goblin Lands or through the Orc Kingdom. You are going through this, Elven Kingdom that has these characteristics, right? That all is a way for you to tell stories. You can have short quests that are tied to the map, the way Tomb of Annihilation does, right? You find the lost city of Nanglor, and that's got something to do, and it has a mini quest and things like that, and you learn more. There's more story. There's payoff for discovering those hexes. That's really important.
Yeah. Yep.
So yeah, do that. Have each day of travel take you further, and that's always my goal as a DM when I run exploration. I'm helping them discover the world, weather, biomes, monsters, dinosaurs, strange fruit, carvings from ancient civilization, undead with symbols on their forehead. All of this lets the players feel the world. I'm reinforcing the plot, flaming fist patrols, right? Redirecting the party, like maybe there's a lost order of the Gauntlet Guard who's trying to return to camp, because that's really where the players were supposed to go. So, save the lost order of the Gauntlet Guard who's being attacked by dinosaurs, reinforces the dinosaur feel, sends them back to the right direction. Highlight party interests. So if they took great pains to help the Order of the Gauntlet, how about we just have a successful patrol come along and update them on the progress at the camp? If they spared the life of some grung, maybe the grung show up to help fight a big monster. Just lots of ways that you can make all of those, whether they're random or planned encounters, and those trips really become part of the larger story. When Ice Road,
the consequences for those,
and the consequences and the payoff,
right?
When Ice Road Trackers comes out, which you wrote, I think that is a really nice exploration example in a very focused, short run setting, and kind of one-shot feel that gives you that idea of trekking through a forest, traps, compelling situations, engagement, choices that pay off or punish depending on what you do. So that's a good example of that. The last thing I would end with is that on Tribality.com, Tomás Jiménez Rioja has a 2-part series on hex crawls with an emphasis on using the idea of the biomes. And so check out his Guide to Hexcrawling series. I've been able to meet and talk with him recently as part of one of the DMs running games in Spanish. He also runs great games in English. So yeah, check out Tomás's articles on Tribality, and we'll have a link in the show notes.
Awesome. Wow. We explored a lot of ground in these last 3 episodes on exploration. Thank you so much for being our guide through this, Teos.
You know, my body's kind of covered in leeches. Is that bad?
Yeah. No, I think
Okay.
that's good. It's good for you, right? Doctors used to do that all the
Right
time.
then.
Okay. And thank you, patrons, and thank you, listeners, for being our guides and letting us know what you like to hear. If you like the show and you would consider becoming a patron for the show, you can find us at patreon.com/MMP. Anywhere from $1 to $10 are there different tiers for what you get, but you always get us at our best, even if we only had 2 or 3 hours of sleep because we were out exploring and we're on watch. And Teos, where can people find you on social media?
Thank you, Sean. I can be found on Twitter at AlphaStream or alphastream.org, my blog.
Excellent. You can find me on Twitter at Sean Merwin, or you can talk to both Teos and I on the forums at forums.misdirectedmark.com. Down with D&D is a Misdirected Mark production, the media arm of Encoded Designs. So, Teos, now that we've explored this strange and wonderful land, what are we going to do now?
We're going to kill some monsters and take their supplies because we're running low.
Yeah, I need some water.
Thanks, Sean.
Get down with D&D.
Yeah, you know me.
Get down with D&D.
Yeah, you know me.
Get down with D&D.
Yeah, you know me.
Who's down with D&D?
This whole party.
You down with D&D?
Yeah, you know me.
You down with D&D?
Yeah, you know me.
I'm down with D&D.
Yeah, you know me.
Who's down with D&D?